Good afternoon and welcome to yet another one of our The Way Forward podcasts. We have the distinct honor and privilege to have Dr. BK Taylor with us today. BK is a long friend, a friend of mine from the day I retired from the Army until today. And I got to tell you, we're going to hear some really interesting stories and backgrounds about this individual and how he has developed to who he is today and where I'm sure he'll go in the future. Some really, really great value in what we're going to learn today from this young man. So BK, with that, I'm going to go ahead and let you introduce yourself, where you're at today. Tell us what your job is, and let's get started.
All right, thanks, Chris. Well, I'm Dr. BK Taylor, as suggested. I am at Westchester University, right outside of Philly, and I am the Assistant Vice President of Student Affairs over Health and Wellness. So my role is to guide health and wellness at this institution. I get to oversee counseling, health services, recreation, and wellness promotion. And I get to chair our care team, which is a unique opportunity where I get to help and intervene where students are experiencing their most distressing and challenging situations. So I have a unique and fun and engaging job.
So please do me a favor, because I had never heard of this in the world that I came from until I met you, and you're in this very unique position at a university. Tell us a little bit more. Where does this fit into the overall scheme? Because most people just think higher ed is faculty, some staff to keep things going, and a whole bunch of students. Where does this fit in?
Yeah, so I get to report directly to the Vice President of Student Affairs. So that division really oversees everything outside the classroom. And one of the growing spaces outside the classroom is healthcare. And that is my responsibility. So I often tell people who don't know higher ed that well that I am more or less a healthcare administrator. And I run kind of a miniature hospital-esque system here, doing public health initiatives, providing medical appointments and medical services and counseling services and everything in between. Beyond that other unique part of my role is the care team, which that process really started to develop after Virginia Tech, to be totally transparent. And it's a process where during Virginia Tech, they realized that a lot of people had seen this young man and really concerning behavior, but there was no real centralized place to evaluate that information and take appropriate actions. So they started developing these teams that are designed just to do that. Centralize information, evaluate, and respond. Now, the good news is I predominantly do not work with people who present violence to the campus. The majority of what I do is work with people who are experiencing significant mental health concerns. So I connect with them, or members of my team connect with them, and we support them and help them navigate higher education when facing really challenging things. And the days of 20 or 30 years ago, it's become ever more complex, ever more difficult. And I see everything from students losing their cars to fires, to homelessness, to major anxiety, depression, and even psychosis.
Yeah. And for the audience, that's the Virginia Tech shooting from like 2007, I think it was, when there was an active shooter there.
Yes.
And I'm familiar with the date because my daughter's best friend from high school was one of the young ladies who was killed. So this hits really close to home for me and my family, that this is now common at universities to have this kind of capability to help our young men and women who are at the university setting, away from home for the first time in many, many cases, and just the stresses associated with going through the college life. And having been a homeless college student for a very short period of time, I understand that to a degree, but not some of the challenges today. So now I'm going to ask you about this passion for what you do, because you're one of the most passionate individuals I've ever met. But this isn't the first job you've had with this. So this is, how many times have you done this? Is this your third university, if I understand it right?
This is my third university. Yep.
Okay. So this is not unusual. This is a common practice amongst different kinds of universities.
I would say it would be far more uncommon for these things not to exist.
Okay.
They're so crucial. So
yeah, and I just think that's critical for the audience to understand that. So it's a whole different environment in which to be a leader. And in these roles, what I've seen you in personally, and know that the two jobs you've moved on to, you've been in a leadership role to do this. And not so much just a leadership role for the students and doing your job, but you have to play, the informal leader, if you would, because nobody else on this campus is in this space except maybe campus security to a degree. But you have to deal with staff, you have to deal with faculty, you have to deal with students. That must be a really incredible challenge when it comes to leadership, whether it's parallel or subordinate leadership going up. How does that work for you, and what have you learned?
Well, I first say that you're not wrong. It is complicated and difficult because you're often dealing with people who are in very uncomfortable situations. I work with people who have a lot of authority within their specific space. So, for example, a faculty member has a great deal of authority in their classroom, and I have little influence over that classroom. But in the moment when they're talking to a student who might be posing a threat or who is causing significant distress, their feelings about that might change pretty significant. So it's always a little bit of a dance of, I'm here to help, but you have authority in this space, and I know you're not feeling comfortable, and negotiating those things. Now, it can vary quite a bit depending on where the concerns are. I have much more influence over like residential halls and other non-academic spaces. I think it's a lot about trust, if I'm really honest with you. I try to tell absolutely everyone I'm talking to, if that's a professor who's afraid of what's happening in their class, to a student that I'm talking to another administrator, even campus safety, is tell them that they're not alone. Like, I know that this is not what you're used to. I know that what you're experiencing is potentially very uncomfortable, but that we're going to do this together, and that I'm going to lend everything I can to help you navigate this situation, for me to help the student navigate this situation, so that we can all really get closer to that goal that we're trying to achieve. And for me, that's about everyone having a place here.
Yeah. Well, and see, that's what's so fascinating to me in higher ed is, in the business world, things are somewhat hierarchical. They're flatter, but they're hierarchical. In the military, things are definitely hierarchical. Clear chain of command, clear responsibilities, clear authorities. But in the world that you operate in, higher education, now you're laughing. I'm being positive here now. Come on. Then in the world that you're operating in, it's very, what's the word I'm looking for? Fungible.
Yeah.
It's kind of, there's no clear boundaries. It kind of blends together. There's shared governance. And so being a leader in there, and you have tremendous responsibility that is not within it's an add-on. Okay. Some people think it's an extra thing that's not necessary, and you've got to get through all the biases associated with that. But how do you maneuver in that space? How is that molded? You have a passion for it, so you have a drive, but what has molded your leadership style? And do you have a leadership style?
I mean, yes, I would say that there's kind of multiple answers to this question. The first one, I think, in the molding and understanding the system that I'm in, right? I think the first thing is you got to really know the terrain. And that's not necessarily a reflection of my leadership style, other than trying to understand that another part of beyond shared governments and the nuances of those relationships is you also are navigating subject matter experts around every corner you go around. And generally, those aren't subject matter experts of your topic. They might be subject matter experts of English or of music. But once a person is a subject matter expert, there is politely a level of ego associated with that you also now get to navigate. And
Which is none of that exists in business. But go ahead.
Yeah, well, of course, I'm sure that it does. But and Chris will note, I have always been in higher ed, and that I have no intention of going anywhere else. I love it over here. I would say that the bigger piece is really about kind of twofold as it pertains to leadership. One of them is really taking an authentic leadership approach. What I do is very, very human. It's wellness, health, wellness, and well-being is truly about people. And so I think being honest about who I am, being honest about, no matter your education or your title, when you're facing some of these things, that stuff dissolves pretty quickly. Because you can be a dean or an AVP or a VP, but when you're faced with a student who may be posing a real threat, that title may not be serving you terribly, great at that moment. On top of, maybe you're a doctor of whatever. In that moment, you may feel very inequipped or very lacking information. So I try to approach it very authentically about who I am and what I do, but also trying to meet them at that same place. And then I think the big piece, and I can get into the nuances of this, but is taking a real kind of infinite leadership approach, which is about focusing on really what is it that we're really here to do, right? I get into a lot of interesting debates, and Chris can probably be one of those people to debate me with about it, but like, I don't do business. I do education, which is fundamentally something different.
Mhm.
And the product and the interaction, what I'm trying to achieve, is also fundamentally different. And in turn, what I'm doing with these people or assisting them with, as it pertains to both the really micro, the one-on-one interactions for student distress, or the macro of cultural change around health, wellness, and well-being, it's about trying to get us to a different place than we are right this second. And I know that sounds like maybe a bit of a bigger scope to think about how you interact with people, but I think it's critical to know why you're in the room, both from a systemic level, but also from a one-to-one level.
Okay.
And what I mean by that is the idea that, higher ed makes a lot of promises, and I'm not sure we always keep them. And
Well,
go
I'm,
ahead.
I'm going to interrupt you because
Oh, please.
what you really do that I admire is you're more of an adaptive leader. Yeah, I mean, you're authentic and you understand the need of trust, and you're very, people centric, which I admire. But you're also smart enough that you put systems and policies and things in place to make routine things routine, and you're very good at that. That is not something that is used universally in higher education. It's very niche, for the faculty to do the expertise areas. There's a certain way you do curriculi. All of that is very, rudimental within the educational system. But for an outlier like you, you've got to put these systems in place to make things happen. And what I've admired about you is that it allows you something that most others at the universities don't seem to get the opportunity to do, which is it gets you up on the balcony. You can get up above the day-to-day noise. And as a leader within the institution, like a utility infielder, you can float around and you can pick up on things across the whole university and see the trends. And you can get up there and you can see the big picture. And then you can give that to leadership. You can anticipate what's happening, either a coming problem or even an opportunity. And when you've done that, when I've seen you do that, people don't seem to take advantage of that. Has that improved? Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, I would say that it's still a struggle. So let me first, maybe I deeply appreciate your compliments, Chris, but I'll demystify it for a moment and say that I'm lucky to be trained as a public health professional and a preventionist, which allows me to take much more of a macro approach. And that my lovely wife would say that I have the mind of an engineer, but the heart of a counselor, and that combination happens to come together in a unique way that most people in my field don't necessarily do. And I also have had the opportunity to train with some very incredible professionals, such as yourself, to develop a skill set to use tools to really mobilize systems and processes in a really functional way. As it pertains to, has that become easier? I'm going to say no, but I do think my ability to articulate that is getting better. And I think there's a parable we use in prevention that we call the parable of the preventionist. And what it is that you come up to the scenario and you see this kid in a river. So you jump into the river and you pull the kid out. And then you see another kid coming down the river. So you jump in, you pull that kid out. And then you start seeing several kids, but more people start jumping in and pulling those kids out. And then you decide to stand up and walk up the river. And someone stops you and says, "What are you doing?" And you say, "Well, I'm going to go up the river. I'm going to figure out where they're falling in." The part that I don't think people appreciate, and that I've tried to articulate as I progress in my career, is they don't note that you actually hate that person. Because imagine the person who gets out of the water and starts walking away. You're mad at them. You are frustrated with, why are they not responding to this situation right now? And how dare they kind of walk upwards? And I think that is a bit of the burden of both leadership, but of this approach, is that you have to own that sometimes it can't be the fire that's in front of you if you plan on doing anything about the fires that are to come. And that can prevent a lot of conflict for people when you challenge their thoughts and their way of thinking about things by saying, well, I see the concern you're saying right now, but if we don't engage with this about the concern that's 3 steps away, we will be facing something far graver.
Oh yeah. Well, and in the military, there's another parable. It's called "Get Left of Bang," and you and I have talked about that. Which is the exact same thing with that parable. If you're just going to stand there where the bomb keeps blowing up and you don't figure out where it's coming from, but more importantly, why it's coming from there, then you're going to just spend all your time in the reactionary mode. And so, the interesting thing about our society is we're very good at responding. Okay. We're not very good at preventing. Okay. Because it's hard to prove a negative. And so we have lots of ambulances. We have lots of crash fire rescue trucks. We have helicopters for life flight. We do all that stuff. We do it really well. We clean up the mess and we go, what happened? We don't know, but we invest all of our time and money in getting ready for the next one to go off. We don't go figure out why it's going off and get after that. And that's that adaptive leadership style that you are using to get up there using that parable. Now, like you said, that can be unpopular. But as you've taught me, being unpopular, doing the right thing is going to be unpopular sometimes. Okay. You have to expect it. And it's going to be the harder thing to do, to figure out, and if you do solve the problem up there, did you actually solve the right problem? So you never know. So there's risk associated with it, and it makes people uncomfortable. But no, that's a perfect scenario. But I think what it does is it makes somebody, I used the word fungible earlier. You're adaptable in your leadership style. Because you and I used to talk about Dan Goleman talks about 6 leadership styles, and he said nobody would ever play golf with just one iron. You have to use all the clubs in the bag. And in a position that you're in, I imagine that that's what you do every day. You've got to use just about every club in your bag to stay ahead of what you're anticipating in that job. Does that get to you after a while? I mean, how do you deal with that?
Well, this is another one where I feel kind of blessed. I think that some people are really good from getting to A to B, and I'll tell you, I'm terrible at it. But if you need to get to A to D in a way that no one else has thought about, I'm your guy. And early in your career, that can be very difficult because realistically, a lot of what you're doing is still trying to build the A to B to C to D. I'm lucky enough to be far in my career that generally when I'm called, the situation it has already gone to D or needs to go to D, and they've tried everything else to get there, and they need someone who can think about it in a different way. And good, bad, or in between. Some days I absolutely love it, and other days I wish that this wasn't necessarily who I am. I don't have much of a choice but to get to D in a different way. And like I said, the good news is if it was easy, then we would have already done it. So I think that's what I would say is most certainly I get the opportunity to try new things, to think about it differently. I also just really enjoy that piece, right? I think part of finding, there's a big piece about meaning in the work that I do, and I'm always excited to talk about. But I also think people should really enjoy and love what they do, like have fun with it. And for me, I love bringing disconnecting ideas together. So if that's, when I was younger and started my career doing more public speaking, I remember listening to the people recite the Declaration of Independence because those words gave me a feeling that I couldn't explain, but I knew it was important. So how do I bring that in, even if it's not what I'm talking about? Or listening to a great speech by a movie like maybe Independence Day or Doctor Who, and seeing something that when you hear it, it gives you chills. I think people will just say, well, that's neat. I think one of the things I love to do is to say, well, how do I bring that into this? And if that's studying physics or computer science or philosophy, I think it's always fun to bring those things together. And I think innovation comes from persistence and the willingness to try new things and a pull from any corner of science that already has done something great. The answers we're looking for are very seldomly in the fields that are studying them. They're in the fields next to them or several steps away. There's an amazing book called Range, if you ever get a chance, that really articulates the power of the generalist and using lots of different thoughts to solve problems in ways we wouldn't have normally thought of.
BK, for whoever watches this video, God bless them. What they ought to do is find one of you in their organization and just put them outside their office and say, just watch everything and tell me at the end of the day, every day, what you think. I have sought minds like yours throughout my career in the Army. I used to joke and call them savants or whatever you want to call them, but it's just an asymmetric mind that looks at the world differently. And if you put them in a job, a pigeonhole them in a job, then they're going to sit in there. They're going to get frustrated because they can see everything else around them, and they can show you how to fix problems. I was very blessed at one point in my career. A guy named General Dick Cody uh, put me in a role where I just kind of floated through the Pentagon and looked at things for him, and I was able to see the everything across the board and start connecting dots when nobody else can do it when they're in their silos and they're going along. And so, one of the best practices I give in business advice to CEOs is have a BK Taylor. Have Colonel Boyd who wrote the OODA Loop. Who wrote a whole book. He drove everybody crazy, but the thing is that you've got to have somebody who's covering your back and looking at things, unless you're trying to do it yourself, which can be very difficult to do. And like you said earlier, it helps you better understand the terrain because we know we all want to understand, visualize, and describe so all as humans can cooperate together. I'm going to change gears real quick, BK. And I want to go back to your history now. You pretty much have been you've been solely in higher ed since the moment of almost birth, if I remember right. Your family was around it, and grew up in it, and you evolved into the man you are today. Health and wellness has clearly become your passion on that journey. I'm curious as to why. And I'm also curious about what have been some of the biggest challenges you've bumped into in your leadership development.
Yeah. Well, I would probably tell you that it started pretty early. To the nuance of me having some connection to education, as you know, Chris, I was raised around a funeral home. So my father was a funeral director. My grandfather was a funeral director. My great-grandfather was a funeral director. As early as I can remember, as I being around a funeral home. I realized pretty quickly that wasn't going to be my path, despite coming from multi-generations of it, and that I maybe wanted to focus a little bit more on life. So what I'll say is it started off a little bit more pathological. So I studied criminology and psychopathology and realized that I'm also a bit obsessive, as Chris will note. I can be a little bit of a dog with a bone at times. And that focus on something that was so dark was pretty destructive to me, and caused a fair amount of damage that I had to work through. But then I stumbled into positive psychology and well-being and the work that I do now, and realized that anyone could have a second lease on life. And it was at that point, with my combinations and my belief in education and the commitments of what higher education can be or is supposed to be, depending on how you want to look at it, that I could be part of delivering a promise for people who maybe didn't feel like they could have access to it. And as Chris noted, I, despite navigating and being in higher education since I was like 17 or 18 now, I didn't really feel like I belonged. I was a student with a pretty significant learning disability in high school and in elementary. I was sent to quote unquote SPED classes because I had an intellectual disability and pretty significant dyslexia. Not to mention pretty severe obsessive compulsive. And I was written off really early. I remember saying things like I wanted to be a lawyer or something like that in school and being told that there's no way that someone like me could achieve that. I was really blessed to have some teachers who saw something else and were willing to invest in me really early. One of the first was my English teacher in high school, who said, I think he can do more than what you think. And English was one of the harder things for me to study. And then I was blessed to find a bunch of people throughout the path that would invest in me, from Dr. Tim Crowley to Dr. Wilmus to Christopher Hughes to Matt Baker and Clarence Green and Don Ehlers, and just a litany of extraordinary leaders who I was truly blessed to connect with, who said, have you thought about that? Or could you do more than that? And who changed my perspective. I spent, and I still struggle to this day, despite being, I guess, Dr. Taylor, the belief that I'm one of the slowest people in the room. and that I don't know as much as the people that are around me. And as Chris will probably reflect, I can really drive people a little batty with that perception because it's not always terribly accurate, and the assumptions I make because of it can be destructive in ways that I don't intend them to be. I think that speaks to some of the question. I'm not sure if I got all.
No, and I'm glad you brought up the dyslexia, because I don't know if I told you, but my dissertation is on the gift of dyslexia. And so as a brother dyslexic, different kind of thinking mind as you, that's what's fascinating about your story is I was always looking for somebody like me, and you're him, to do the things that I did for other people. And that's what I'm excited about. You know, you inspired me. I watched you go get your doctoral degree, well knowing that you had dyslexia, and knowing that you, like all of us with dyslexia, we all carry around that fear that we're going to be discovered at any minute as a stupid person, because that's what we've been told. We carry the shame of can't spell, can't read. You know, we can write because there's a lot of technology now that allows our brain to transpose it into neurotypical language as other people use, but us neurodiverse people, you know, we're out there, and that's what I'm writing my dissertation about is go find these guys and gals. You know, they're mostly guys. Statistically, they're mostly guys because it's a genetic thing that goes from the father to the son, and to the daughters in some cases, but predominantly to us. Go find these people because they're going to look at the world in a very different way, and their minds move so quickly. That's the big thing that, you know, I've been to the neuroscience of it now, where the pathways from a problem to hit your eye takes a different pathway than a neurotypical person. And the neurotypical person goes through a much more greater sequence of logic to get to the decision. Ours just kind of cuts the corner and goes straight to the house and says, I'm here. Now, we see the answer, but we don't really necessarily know how we got there. And that's the part where we go to D when they're still trying to get past B. Okay, so BK, I'm going to put you on the spot. So you've been in a lot of different environments in the higher ed world. And, you know, in the civilian world, I keep hearing terms like toxic leaderships or difficult environments for people to develop. The Army has struggled a bit, you know, 20 years of war. We weren't able to mentor as much. You've talked about how important mentors were to your development. When you find yourself with your very unusual and gifted mind, which is dyslexic, but that's a gift, that we can talk about in a whole different episode. And you're in the environment where things are not conducive for your innovation and your good ideas and your recommendations. How do you control yourself from a self-awareness perspective and understanding the social awareness part of it when you're in that kind of environment? What kinds of lessons can you draw for those of us who are caught up in those quote unquote toxic environments?
Well, I think taking a step back and looking at the people, right, is the one thing that I have learned, and Chris was a big contributor to this, is I can build, right? Like if you give me the Lego set, I can build and I can build and I can build. But one of the really important things, no matter how good at a solution you are, is you can't build without considerations of its sustainability, of the people around it, and the people who are impacted by it. So one of the things that I've really had to work on is taking a step back and be like, okay, I see the answer, but where are the people? And you know, when you start talking about toxic, you know, that's a good word for me because it translates very well into health and wellness, because it's basically illness, right? And you see harm and you see the need for healing. And I think taking those steps back to realize that if you're wanting to achieve the things that maybe you inspire towards or that you can see out in the future, that you can't do it alone, and that it's going to be really predicated on potentially being part of healing people, but probably more practically healing an organization.
Yeah.
Because we don't think about that much, right? At least in higher ed, we seem to make pretty big pivots without taking consideration that we've basically hacked a limb off, maybe moved it to the other side, and now you're like, go and be at 100% again. This being A doesn't know what it is anymore. You've changed it. You fundamentally removed part of who it was, and you haven't created who it is now. And in that process of of that change, that manipulation, that modification, you also haven't taken the time to do the physical therapy, the healing that really needs to occur. And your people will suffer from that. And if you don't do that, even worse than that, is when you heal incorrectly, it is far more destructive, right? You think about, the idea of setting a bone. Well, the reason is because that bone heals the way that it is fundamentally more fragile, it's fundamentally more painful. And if you think about it from a psychological standpoint, you see unhealthy coping mechanisms begin to grow from unfixed, unresolved trauma. And so if without engaging with that, you can't really move forward. So I've always taken a step back and started looking at the people. Where are those people at? Where is the organization at? What are the wounds that are open? What are the things that maybe haven't healed correctly that you may have to do some really painful bone setting? But that's the work we have to do to get to where we're going and navigate it from that space.
Yeah.
Hope that speaks to a little bit.
Well, and I've seen you do that at the micro level, and I know you've been a part of it at the macro level. I guess the question for me would be, how do you actually do that? I mean, what are because it's probably the reason we don't get rid of toxic leaders statistically is because they actually are producing. Okay. And so from the board or the boss above, you see this thing is working. They're getting more students, they're getting, they're increasing enrollment, they're doing all the positive things, the graduation rates are up, in higher ed and in in the private sector, it's, got more Lamborghinis coming off the line and they're better quality. But it's how long can that be sustained before you actually injure the creature that is your organization. And so when you're trying to figure out, do I cut out that cancer, the hard part is like you said, how long will it take to recover? Because I can't just replace it. I can put a new boss in there, but it's going to take time. And so that's another hesitancy of why boards and stuff don't want to fire somebody who's toxic, because it's going to disrupt what's working. It's going to take time to find a replacement. It's going to take time to heal, if it can be healed. And you have to assume that cancer may have spread and you've created other little pockets of it that are doing, that have been taught the wrong way to behave when it comes to dealing with people. So, I mean, that's a great observation, and companies really have to think about that. I think the worst decision that usually happens is they wait too long. It's just like all of us. If something hurts and we don't go to the doctor until it gets to be this big, huge bump on the side of your head. And then we go in and go, hey, can you fix this? Then that's going to take a long time to heal. So that's a great analogy. I like that. In the experience of going through that, how did you personally, when you were in a toxic environment, how did you go about healing yourself?
Ooh, healing myself. That is always the universal challenge, right? Because it's when you're in a toxic situation, often what the person does is effectively make you question who you are. So what it comes back to is grounding yourself in that. The biggest thing that I'd advocate for that are mentorship, are those connections, those relationships, those people who have seen you, who you, and who you can say the truth to, and who will be honest with you about that, because they allow you to shake that false reality that's being projected onto you and maintain that sense of self that you desperately will need when navigating those spaces.
Okay. How do you encourage young men and women that you interact with to do what you just said? How do you approach that? Do you formalize that and say, look, you need to find a mentor and here's what I suggest? Or how do you approach that?
This is actually one that I have deeply struggled with, because I do have a lot of conversations about it. So I'm probably still, I think the thing that I'll also own in all this is I'm still very much growing in any process. And I can't imagine the day where that won't be the case. So, but I think my answer would be, we all admire people for various traits, right? And, sitting down and just understanding a person. You asked me, a question you noted a little earlier was, well, how do you do this? And the answer I would say is see people. see them, like really see them, not I've heard this about you or this is your role, but see them for who they are, for what they bring to the table, for what drives them and motivates them. And once you do that, it's hard not to develop a relationship, right? Because once a person feels seen, they feel connected to, and you have a vested interest in them. The part that I would say with mentorship is that when when you're intentional about seeing people, is you see things that you admire and or who might reflect things that you wish you could grow or learn about yourself. And I think the willingness to be courageous and say, hey, tell me about yourself. I just want to know, right? I just want to learn about your journey. And what I would say is, really value the ones who are different, right? Because I think similarities will come. Like that's inevitable. I think the moment I walked into Chris's door, I don't know if I would have ever guessed that there were similarities that day. But the moment that I walked into your door, Chris, I knew that you had an incredible skill set that I didn't know anything about, but I knew it was something that I didn't have. And when we got connected, I got to learn so much from you. And then the similarities came along the way. I think taking that risk to say, hey, I don't know you, but I'm excited to learn and to get to know you. And I can't think of a time where that hasn't served me well. From the start of my career to literally last week, where I sat down and had coffee with someone. The power of just connecting, and I know it sounds silly and maybe overly simple, but just taking time to have coffee to get to know people has always treated me super well.
Well, and in the environment that I came from, we were taught that mentors are chosen, not selected, or not assigned. And so I think that's, for anybody who's younger, who's out there, anybody who's out there, is if you don't have a mentor right now, why not would be the question. I think, I have a mentee who I said, who's your mentor at work? And he said, I don't have one. I said, is there not somebody that you admire or somebody who does something that you want to learn and do it in a more informal fashion, coffee, like you said? And he said, well, yes. I said, well, have you asked him? He said, no, because that would be obstinate of me to just assume that this person would be interested in doing it. And what was interesting was I pushed him and he did it. And the guy said, yeah, okay, how do we do this? And it was like he had no clue. And you know what? That's okay. It's okay. Some young person or a peer, even a superior, comes into you and says, I would like to learn more about what you do and how you think. And because I find it interesting, and it's not an ego thing. It's not, the mentor doesn't have to come up with some sort of, formalized strategy or any of that. I think we put too much thought into how formalized it should be. It should just be establish a relationship and then ask those questions. One of my continued mentors is Hank Kinnison. And Hank Kinnison saw one of our previous podcasts and he called me. And he said, hey, let's talk about your podcast. He talked about me and Ross Kaufman and he gave me his 2 cents and he gave me all of this great golden nuggets of ideas to use in the future. And then he told me all this nice stuff about me that made me feel important. Even at my age, here's my old boss calling me and saying, Chris, you're doing great. And I cannot put a value on that. I mean, and I think all of us as leaders or aspiring leaders, or you don't even have to be a leader, find a mentor and you know what, make yourself accessible to a mentee, because what I've learned, like young Molly, who's recording this, I learn as much from her as she'll ever learn from me. And so it's always a two-way street. So I'm glad you brought up mentorship. Let's end with this, or let's start to wind down with this. What makes BK Taylor get up in the morning and run to work every day? Because I know you do. What is it?
I mean, I think it is. My first answer wants to be it's people, right? I think my second part of that would be, and it's possibility. What keeps me here and what keeps me running to it is that I'm not going to change the well-being of our nation. I don't think that's going to happen. But what I don't know is the student who will. Because I get the pleasure to work with just infinite possibility, to reconsider, to discuss, to educate, to talk about just about everything. And the students I get to work with, the systems I'm a part of contributing towards that students' learning, means that they're going to create things that I never would have imagined. And we then get to be what we hope to be, right? Like that's the idea of education. Like we've kind of lost track of, and we lost a little bit of that thread. And you could reflect that in a lot of different mediums about, higher ed is about getting a job or those things. And I'm not saying that that's not part of the equation, but in my mind, higher education is about well-being. And what I mean by well-being is becoming the best possible version of yourself and realizing that by becoming the best possible version of yourself, you really need to deconstruct barriers so that others can become the best version of themselves. And that's what excites me, right? Is that we can commit to that promise and we can deliver on that promise so that people can take these ideas and these concepts and go further and greater than any of us would have ever fathomed, and be excited about those opportunities. And I think I could name 100 ways where that's true. From I can't imagine our founding fathers thinking about the world that we live in now and the possibilities and the power of the words that they wrote and what they ultimately became, to Nikola Tesla and his alternating current and what it's become to communication and science. So many of our contributions start with this idea of education and possibility and the willingness to not hold people back, but to lift them up. So.
Very nice, very nice. And I do want to point out one thing for our viewing audience. We don't interview people who have offices that are just riddled with degrees and I love me stuff on the walls. They have, move your head just a little bit so we can see you
my sticky notes?
Your sticky notes going there. And then over to your right, you got your dry erase board. So you're always visualizing when you're discussing things with people. You actually look like you work there. And our last couple of guests, even our 3-star general was in an office with almost the exact same setting behind you, because you do love what you do. It's not about you, it's about everybody else. Because like you said, you're not going to change the world, but you might be mentoring that young person who will. And I admire that about you, BK. Thanks, brother. Appreciate your time today.
It was a pleasure. It was a pleasure. Thank you, Chris.
You bet, buddy.